Welcome everyone to an edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and civil government. My name is Eric Loophole. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. So we're continuing with our study of the history of the United States. And in the previous episode, we looked at the relationship between the church and the state around the time of the Reformation and slightly afterwards, and looked at some of the things that were going on regarding how to handle differences of religious opinions and whether or not the civil magistrate should enforce certain things and how far he should go in doing so. And then we looked at how the Reformation kind of began in England but didn't really go all the way, and this led to some concerns regarding the purity of the church and the role of the monarch as the defender of the faith. And we ended with looking at the rise of the Puritans and the first settlers going to America. Now, this episode, I'm going to take the next step and look at the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. So there's a lot there. Might not be able to get all of it today. We'll do the best that I can. But before I begin, I just want to say that as I was preparing and researching all of this, there was so much more that I didn't realize that it's very important to understand the context of the American colonies and the future war for independence. And this is definitely not the stuff that I learned growing up in school or even in college. So I hope that you find this useful, because I certainly did. So let's go back into the time frame here. It's now 1610 or so, and King James I is King of England. Now, there have already begun to be some struggles between the king and Parliament. Parliament is kind of like Congress. It's a little bit different. There's a House of Commons, House of Lords. But historically, Parliament has the authority to create new taxes. Not so much the king. That's not really the king's realm historically or traditionally in England at this time. And so what James I is doing is he's beginning to try to collect taxes without using Parliament. He creates imports and duties and tariffs, and he can change the rates and the ranges of these tariffs in order to try to get taxes without Parliament's approval because, well, they're kind of restraining him when Parliament's in session. Now, in 1610, the House of Commons speaks against what James is doing. One of the members of Parliament is James Whitlock, and he says this. He says, quote, "As the kings of England are generally, without exception, bound from making or altering laws, so by the same rule, they are as generally bound from laying new charges or impositions on their subjects." End quote. And then he goes on to say this. He says, quote, "If the king alone out of Parliament may impose, he alters the law of England in one of these two fundamental points. He must either take his subjects' goods from them without assent of the party, which is against the law, or else he must give his own letters patents, the force of law, to alter the property of his subjects' goods, which is also against the law." End quote. What's he saying there, basically? If he's going to change the tax structure, or if he's going to alter duties, imports of tariffs, and the value upon which he can tax something, that's illegal because you can either steal someone's stuff without their consent, which is obviously illegal, or you can change the value of someone's stuff, which is another way to go about stealing someone's stuff, right? And that's also illegal. Again, for the king to do this without Parliament's approval. That's as far as it goes, really, with King James. And then when he dies and Charles, his son, Charles I, takes the throne, he inherits a lot of the problems from his father, and he kind of makes them worse. So, for example, in 1626, he forces several wealthy citizens in England to give him loans. So it's a forced loan. It's not technically stealing. I mean, it kind of is, but it's like he says to a person, "You will loan me money. I'll pay you back with interest, but there's no choice in the matter. You must loan it to me." Because again, he couldn't really get taxes through from Parliament. And the excuse he gave was that these were a necessity. It was an emergency. They needed the money. Now, 5 of the men refused to give a loan to King Charles. So, what does the king do? He has them imprisoned. Makes sense? They eventually obtain writs of habeas corpus, which basically is show the body. You need to prove or justify why you put this person into prison. Okay? I mean, we have this today in the United States, and we should be thankful that we got this from our English heritage. Because essentially, the king or the civil magistrate cannot just arrest you and put you in prison for no reason. Okay, there needs to be a reason given. Now, Charles, when he's asked by the courts what the reason is, he says that they were imprisoned by a special command of the king, which is kind of like a catch-all, but it's not really a reason. So even though he tries to do this with the forced loans thing, it doesn't really work out. He needs more money. Okay, so he does assemble Parliament a few years later, around 1628. And so when Parliament enters into session, they petition to the king. And they say this, quote, "We humbly pray, your most excellent majesty, that no man hereafter be compelled to make or yield any gift, loan, benevolence, tax, or such like charge without common consent by act of Parliament." End quote. All right, so they say this, please don't do this anymore. And in 1629, so basically a year later, King Charles I dissolves Parliament. So that's what the king was allowed to do that. He could dissolve Parliament, and basically everyone goes home. There's no more Congress. He just is going to run things without Parliament. You don't need to have a Parliament, right? And that's fine if you don't need any new laws and if you don't need any new taxes. If you don't really need to change anything, you're just kind of keeping things going the way they are. The closest example we have of this is when Congress recesses or isn't in session for certain times out of the year. So at that point, obviously no new taxes are being levied and there's no new laws being passed, but the government is still running, right? And the president still does his thing as commander-in-chief of the army. So anyways, King Charles dissolves Parliament, and this happens for 11 years. Parliament is not in session for 11 years after Charles dissolves it. So they don't come back until 1640. All right, so that's some of the economic stuff going on here. Now, what about some of the religious battles between King Charles and Parliament and the Puritans? Well, one of the major issues is a man by the name of William Laud is appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, which is that's the highest religious position in England, Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. Now, Laud is very harsh towards the Puritans, so he bans Puritan tracts and preaching, and when he was Bishop of London in 1628, he actually banned preaching on predestination, so very specific doctrinal issues that he did not like. He also required that everyone had to kneel when taking communion, and anyone who dissented from his religious rules were punished using the king's court, the king's star chamber, which the Star Chamber, and I talked about this, I think, a couple of years ago, but it's essentially a court that does not provide due process for English citizens. They could do things kind of outside of the normal method of the law. They could regulate building codes and trade prices, licenses of newspapers and the press, and there was no jury required to judge you. It was just the bureaucracy, the ministers that could do it. So anyways, they controlled licensing of newspapers and printing. And so those who said things or printed things that were contrary to William Laud's policies, those people found themselves in the Star Chamber. There was one notable Puritan named William Prynne who was publishing tracts and treatises against the stage plays. So think of like the theater. Why is that a big deal? Well, he was criticizing the fact that the royal family was participating in the theater and enjoying these very lewd stage plays. But as a result, he had his ears cut off after being condemned by the Star Chamber. So that's some of the stuff that was going on against the Puritans in England. And then furthermore, William Laud tried to impose Anglicanism on Scotland. So this is important to keep in mind here, and is that Scotland at this time has its own parliament, right? It's had that since the 1200s. So they have one common king, King Charles, but separate parliaments. England has their parliament and Scotland has their parliament. So the Scottish parliament is in charge of handling laws and taxes and policies for Scotland, and the English Parliament for England. But what William Laud is doing is he's trying to force a modified version of the Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Presbyterian churches. And so when William Laud tries to impose Anglicanism on Scotland, the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish churches publish the National Covenant of 1638. And for the most part, this covenant is against Anglicanism and any vestige of Roman Catholicism. So, for example, it says, quote, "But in special we detest and refuse the usurped authority of that Roman Antichrist upon the Scriptures of God, upon the Kirk, the civil magistrate, and consciences of men, all his tyrannous laws made upon indifferent things against our Christian liberty, his erroneous doctrine against the sufficiency of the written word, the perfection of the law, the office of Christ, and his blessed evangel." End quote. So, as you can see, they don't really like the Roman Catholic Church very much. But here's their petition. They say, quote, "We noblemen, barons, gentlemen, burgesses, ministers, and commons, undersubscribing, considering diverse times before, and especially at this time, the danger of the true Reformed religion, of the king's honor, and of the public peace of the kingdom, by the manifold innovations and evils generally contained and particularly mentioned in our late supplications, complaints, and protestations, do hereby profess, and before God, his angels, and the world, solemnly declare, that with our whole hearts we agree and resolve all the days of our life constantly to adhere to and defend the true religion, and forbearing the practice of all innovations already introduced in the matters of the worship of God, or approbation of the corruptions of the public government of the kirk or church, or civil places and power of kirkmen, till they be tried and allowed in free assemblies and in parliaments to labor by all means lawful to recover the purity and liberty of the gospel, that we shall defend the same and resist all these contrary errors and corruptions according to our vocation, and to the utmost of that power that God has put into our hands all the days of our life. And in like manner, with the same heart, we declare before God and men that we have no intention or desire to attempt anything that may turn to the dishonor of God or the diminution of the king's greatness and authority." So that's just a few parts of the National Covenant. And the whole point is that the Scots, they basically say, look, we're going to follow what we believe to be the true religion, and any changes, need to be ratified by Parliament, but we're going to honor the king. We're not here to usurp his authority, okay? Now, Charles I viewed the National Covenant of the Scots as treasonous, okay? And you can see how, because he's the head of the Church of England, but he's also the king and the monarch over Scotland, not just England, right? So where does his authority as far as religious aspects go? Because, obviously when it comes to things like laws and taxation, Scotland and England have their own parliaments. They handle their own affairs. But under one sovereign ruler, who is also the head of the church, doesn't he have the authority to dictate what happens in the religious realm? And that includes appointing Archbishop William Laud to standardize religion across England. Well, that's the disagreement, right? And so this led to the First Bishops' War in England between the king's troops and the Scots. There were some minor skirmishes, but it ended pretty quickly with a treaty, the Treaty of Berwick, and the agreement was that King Charles would allow a general assembly of church leaders and churchmen in Scotland to call and to assemble, and they would vote on and decide what they wanted to do regarding being more Anglican or being more Presbyterian. Well, when that assembly happened, they reaffirmed the National Covenant and basically said no to Anglicanism. And then Parliament in Scotland, the Scottish Parliament, ratified the results of this church assembly. And so Charles did not like the outcome, and so he went back on his promise, broke the Treaty of Berwick, and that resulted in the Second Bishops' War. But the thing is that this required money, this war between Charles and essentially Scotland. He needed money. So that's why he called English Parliament in 1640. He needs to get new taxes. But the thing is, it's been 11 years, and there's been a lot of angst going on here. So as soon as Parliament in England is called and assembled, they begin passing laws to limit King Charles's power. So for example, they pass a law stating that the king can no longer dissolve Parliament without Parliament's consent. Oh, that's interesting, right? That's a little deviation from the past, right? So now both sides start making attempts to defeat the other one and limit the other one. So King Charles begins to seek support from Irish Catholics, and Parliament in England starts to seek support and closer ties with Scotland, because Scotland is Presbyterian and Puritan, essentially. Now in 1642, this back and forth continues, and Charles gets so frustrated that he attempts to arrest 5 members of Parliament in England for opposing his policies. Now they escape his attempt, but that didn't work. And so when that didn't work, Charles leaves London and raises his military banner and essentially declares war on English Parliament. And that kicks off the English Civil War in 1642. Now, why is this happening? Well, one of the reasons is Charles has inherited from his father, James, the divine right of kings, that the monarch is absolute, and that there's really no authority over the monarch except God himself. So this is one of the reasons why these things are happening. Now, as a result, the Parliament becomes more pro-Puritan and anti-monarch. And there are concerns about the king negotiating with the Irish to bring in, essentially foreign troops, Irish troops into England. Now, at this point in 1644, the Solemn League and Covenant is formed. It's very similar to the National Covenant. It's essentially an agreement between the Puritans of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And so here's what the agreement says, quote, "We shall sincerely, through the grace of God, endeavor in our places and callings the preservation of the Reformed religion in the Church of Scotland, in doctrine, worship, discipline, and government, against our common enemies, and the reformation of religion in the kingdoms of England and Ireland, in doctrine, worship, discipline, and government, according to the word of God, and the example of the best reformed churches. And we shall endeavor to bring the churches of God in the 3 kingdoms to the nearest conjunction and uniformity in religion, confession of faith, form of government, directory for worship, and catechizing, that we and our posterity after us may, as brethren, live in faith and love, and the Lord may delight to dwell in the midst of us." End quote. So what they want is reformed religion and conformity and unity among all 3 kingdoms of England, Ireland, and Scotland. So basically, they want to further the Reformation. They don't want the Church of England and any vestiges of Roman Catholicism. But they also say this, they say, quote, "We shall with the same sincerity in our several vocations endeavor with our estates and lives mutually to preserve the rights and privileges of the parliaments, plural, and the liberties of the kingdoms, and to preserve and defend the King's Majesty's person and authority in the preservation and defense of the true religion and liberties of the kingdoms, that the world may bear witness with our consciences of our loyalty, and that we have no thoughts or intentions to diminish His Majesty's just power and greatness." End quote. So again, they don't believe that they are overthrowing the king. They're not trying to diminish the king's authority. They just want to reform the church further in conformity with the word of God, and not stick with Anglicanism. Now, this Solemn League and Covenant was approved by both England and Scottish parliaments, and it was signed by many dignitaries and nobles of all 3 kingdoms, including Ireland. Now, in 1646, King Charles I is defeated in battle, and he ends up surrendering to the Scottish army. Now, there is evidence to suggest that he was seeking Catholic support from outside of England. That includes Ireland and France to help him in his military battles. And just for the record, his wife was a French Catholic. And this did not help his situation. It made him look even more suspicious that he's trying to get foreign military powers to come in. Now, the Scots end up turning him over to the English Parliament, and so he's in custody there. Now, what's worth noting is that the army of England, England's parliamentary army, is mostly made up of independents, not Presbyterians. So let's just reiterate there. You have multiple groups of Puritans. Puritans, in general, just want the church to be more reformed. Okay, they want to change the church and purify the church in accordance with Scripture. Okay, but the Presbyterians want a standardized denomination in which there is a church authority or hierarchy. You have the General Assembly, and then you have the presbyters, but then you have other Puritans who are more independent, and they would say that each local church needs to be independent and have its own church authority, of course, elders and deacons, but there's no General Assembly, like official authority over it in this, denomination or anything like that. At least that's how I understood the differences between the independents and the Presbyterians. Now, Oliver Cromwell is himself an independent, and he's in command of the Parliament's army, or the New Model Army, as it would become known. Now, the Parliament is also bickering among itself because, well, they're not all Presbyterian. They're mostly Puritan, but some are independent, and so they really could not enforce full Presbyterian church government in England. And what Cromwell and the army wanted was toleration of independence and other Protestant and Reformed views. So Cromwell and the independents are the most tolerant-minded, and were even okay with allowing Catholics to reside in England, but not obviously enforcing any kind of Catholic worship practices. So then King Charles I, being imprisoned, he tries to regain power. So he begins negotiations with all three groups: the Scots, the English Parliament, and the army. So there's three essential entities there. And he made contradictory promises to all three of them. So just for an example, to the Scots, he promised that he would enforce Presbyterianism in England for 3 years, because the Scots are Presbyterian. They're not independent. They're Puritan, but they want a Presbyterian form of church government, and they would love that everywhere, not just in Scotland. And so Charles is like, hey, if you support me, I will force England to be Presbyterian for 3 years. Now, the English Parliament wanted him to sign the Solemn League and Covenant document that they had signed. And then the independents, under Cromwell and the army, offered him very lenient terms. So here are some of the terms that Cromwell and the independents offered King Charles. First, the monarchy would continue, so he would not be removed from office, and he would retain his power to veto basically anything that Parliament did. Parliament would control the army and the navy for 10 years, just to make sure that the king doesn't, use that military to try to destroy the Parliament. Parliaments would be called every 2 years, so they're not constantly in session, but at least every 2 years they would have to be called. And their representation would be more proportional, appropriate there, based on taxation. And then there would be broad religious toleration for Protestant groups. The Book of Common Prayer would still be available, but it wouldn't be required or forced upon everybody, and people would not be punished for not attending church or for attending other church services. And then as far as the bishops go, so the bishops are, the structure of the Church of England, like the archbishops, the bishops would remain, but they would not have any authority to coerce or force churches to conform to particular, religious practice, religious worship. So that seems pretty reasonable, right, from our American perspective. But Charles doesn't want any of that. I mean, he wants to get the best deal that he can get because, again, he believes in the divine right of king. He really shouldn't be negotiating with anybody from his perspective, but he's just doing it because he has to. So Charles ends up making a deal with the Scots and then tries to escape. But the escape doesn't work, and then the Scots, because they made a deal with Charles, so they actually begin to go to war with the English. Because, hey, we made a deal with King Charles. We are going to stick to our agreement. He wants us to come help him, so we're going to invade England and beat up on the English Parliament and the army, and that'll help King Charles, and then he'll fulfill his end of the bargain. But Cromwell and the New Model Army crushed the Scots, and so they're defeated, and Charles is captured again and is considered no longer trustworthy. And so he is put on trial and executed for treason. Now, like I said, he believes that he has the divine right of kings, and he actually says, quote, "The king can do no wrong," end quote. And like I said, he believes he's only answerable to God, and that there is no earthly court that exists that can judge him. He also, this is important, he also does not believe that the people should have any share in government. Okay, here's what he says, quote, "As for the people, truly I desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody, whomsoever, but I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government, those laws by which their lives and their goods may be most their own. It is not for having share in government. That is nothing pertaining to them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things," end quote. So that's pretty clear. Charles does not think that the people should have any share in the government. They just need to have a government. Okay, that's it. So Charles I is executed, and Cromwell serves as Lord Protector and essentially runs the government. And then there's the Rump Parliament. There's a lot more politics that goes on because things just don't get that much better because Parliament bickers among itself regarding Presbyterianism, independence, things like that. So now, what about Charles II? So Charles II is Charles I's son, living in exile. Okay, but he tries to regain his father's throne. So in 1650, Charles II signs the Solemn League and Covenant. And this is to gain the support of the Scots and the Scottish Parliament. But he actually signs the document that promises and swears to reform the Church of England, Scotland, and Ireland. So again, the Scots are convinced to give support to, this time, Charles II. And so he lands in Scotland. But again, both he and the Scots are defeated by Cromwell and the New Model Army. So Charles II has to go back in exile. Now, what's interesting to note, though, is that later on, and this is after Cromwell dies, and I think the late 1650s, when Charles II does take the throne, because when Cromwell dies and he puts his son in his place as Lord Protector, he quickly falls, and basically everyone welcomes back the monarch. They want a king again. And so King Charles II takes the throne in 1660, and he repudiates the Solemn League and Covenant that he signed 10 years earlier, and he has it publicly burned. So that's what he really believes, really feels about the Solemn League and Covenant. Now, he does promise liberty of conscience, so you can kind of believe what you want on religious matters. But by 1661, so 1 year later, he breaks this promise, and he enforces the Book of Common Prayer and prohibits 4 or more people from gathering for any non-Anglican style of worship. So previously, he promised liberty of conscience on religion, including freedom of worship, and to not have to use the Book of Common Prayer if you don't want to. But 1 year later, no, not the case. Everyone's going to use the Book of Common Prayer, and no worship that's not Anglican is allowed between 4 or more people gathered together. So King Charles II, he reigns until his death in 1685, and on his deathbed, he converts to Catholicism. So he was basically a hidden Catholic the entire time. So this does not sit very well with pretty much most of the people of England, Puritan or otherwise. But he had no heirs to the throne, so his younger brother, James II, takes the throne. And he also just like the rest of the family, favors the divine right of kings, and James himself favors Catholicism. Now, he goes much further than anybody else before him. He suspends any anti-Catholic laws, and he begins appointing Catholics into positions of power and ministry positions. He also dissolves Parliament for opposing his Catholic policies, and if you remember, Parliament had previously passed a law under Charles I that the king can't dissolve them without approval, but now the king's doing it anyways. And so several English nobles are seeking help, and they reach out to a man named William of Orange to help protect the Protestant religion in England. Now, William is a minister in the government of the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, the Dutch, are very Protestant, and William is one of the ministers there. And he's married to King James II's daughter, Mary, and she's Protestant. So William lands in England with his army in 1688, and basically King James II loses all support. His army deserts him. Basically everything falls apart around him. They were just waiting for this last, straw to break the camel's back. And so James II flees to France and throws the royal seal into the River Thames. Okay, and English Parliament interprets that as him abdicating the throne by throwing away the royal seal. And so King William and Queen Mary are allowed to reign. And so this is now the reign of William and Mary. So if you ever hear of the College of William and Mary, that's who it's named after. And they support and ratify the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And I'll list some of the rights here. So for example, Parliament is to be held more frequently. The military, this is important, the military is now under the command of Parliament, not the king. And Parliament is now the final authority for all laws and taxes. The monarchy must always be Protestant, can't be Catholic. And the English Bill of Rights also affirmed the rights of subjects to petition the king without fear of prosecution, and the right of Protestants to bear arms, as allowed by law. And the bill also prohibits excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment, like having your ears cut off. And so this is very much fundamental to the American colonies. Now, what's happening in the colonies during this entire time? Because they have an opinion on this matter too. Now, they're not very large, the colonies, not yet, but they have an opinion. So let's take a look very briefly at that. In 1629, Massachusetts Bay forms their charter, okay, their colony, and it's under the reign of King Charles I. Now, that colony and the colonial government had the authority to tax and pass laws as needed, and a portion of those revenues were sent back to the king, and the colony would be self-governing like its own little parliament under the king. That's why it's called New England. It's like England, their own parliament. It's like Scotland. They have their own parliament, but one sovereign monarch. And so in New England, you have the Puritans, because they're predominantly Puritans that settle there. They actually both support and oppose Parliament. See, they support religious toleration and the cause of the Puritans in Parliament, because many of the Puritans had come to the American colonies when William Laud was persecuting them in England. But they don't recognize Parliament's supremacy under Cromwell. So, for example, when Cromwell takes over and passes what's called the Navigation Act of 1651, basically at this time there was some angst between England and the Dutch, and so Cromwell and Parliament wanted to hurt the Dutch trading, so they passed this act which prohibited the English from trading with the Dutch and prohibited the colonies from trading with the Dutch. Well, the colonies ignored it. They recognized themselves as their own governing body because the Navigation Act did not apply to Scotland. Scotland is their own parliament, passing their own laws. So the Navigation Act applied to England and its domains, but the colonies viewed themselves as New England. They have their own government, so they completely ignored the Navigation Act passed by Parliament under Cromwell. So for the most part, the colonies stayed out of the English Civil War. they were basically left to their own devices. And so this English Civil War actually helped the colonies to mature because they were on their own. They had to manage their own affairs, enforce their own laws, collect their own taxes, all those things because of so much chaos going on in England, Ireland, and Scotland. And so when things settle down in England and England begins to try to impose itself upon the colonies like, seriously? We've been independent for so long. Yes, of course we recognize the monarch as our king, but we are our own parliament, like England, like Scotland. So just for an example, John Winthrop, who was in Massachusetts, he initially supports Parliament, but becomes critical of its divisiveness and its execution of King Charles I. So he was a Puritan, but he didn't support the execution of King Charles, but he did support religious toleration. And then John Cotton, who was a minister in Boston, he was a bit more radical. He supported the war and the removal of King Charles I, and he recognized the limit to all earthly power. He says, quote, "It is necessary, therefore, that all power on earth be limited, church power or any other power," end quote. So you see here that there's both support and criticism of Parliament going on in the American colonies because the Americans recognize all power needs to be limited in some sense, whether it's the church, like the Church of England, whether it's the Parliament, or whether it's the king. They all have to have limitations put upon them. And this is a distinctly Christian and Puritan perspective. And so all of this will set the stage for the future American War for Independence, which we will get into next time. So I hope that you find this somewhat helpful in understanding the framework, the mindset of what's going on at this time, and particularly the idea that the Americans viewed themselves as their own governing bodies, like Parliament, and they were. And so that's going to be a key factor in understanding why the Americans were so hostile to what England was doing to the colonies leading up to the American War for Independence. So if you have any questions, comments, or maybe some counterpoints, I would love to talk about them. So please feel free to email me at thegpgpodcast@gmail.com or go on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, look for Eric Leupold or Governed by God. You can also go to ericleupold.com and you can just submit questions that way. But I hope that you found this useful and that you'll come back again next time to look at the American War for Independence. And so until then, take care and God bless.